At any point in time, a mystery can pop up out of the blue. The most puzzling sorts almost seem impossible to solve. But on the odd occasion, we're surprised by the most persistent sleuths and previously missed clues. Number 5. Eliza Mary Barrow was an eccentric spinster. In the early 1900s, she acquired a young boy, an orphaned son of a friend, whom she'd pledged to look after. The 47-year-old began looking for a house to settle into, with some substantial savings and annuities. This led her to a man named Frederick Seddon. Frederick was a well-known family man who had 5 children, a successful career, and a luxurious home. He was known to be an honorable member of society, a respectable man who received praise for his charitability. Seddon, the son of William and Mary Ann, married his wife and mother of their children, Margaret, at an early age. They moved to a home at 88 Belmont Road in Anfield, but later opted to move to a family home in London. It was a 14-bedroom house, but the cost was no issue for Seddon, who then secured a job as a superintendent of collectors for an insurance company. But with such wealth and praise, there was greed. Throughout his life, Seddon developed an overpowering obsession with money. It was 1909, and the family man was juggling a few jobs to make more money, and decided to add just an extra string to achieve this. The string came in the form of a landlord. In order to find a tenant for their second-floor, spacious London home, Margaret and her husband released an advertisement. This advertisement conveniently found its way to Eliza, who was looking for a house at the time. She responded to Seddon's search for a tenant, but little did she know that he had greed in mind. The easily led woman was convinced to transfer control of her interest and her savings to Seddon. In return, she would receive an annual sum and be living rent-free. Despite this, Eliza and the family grew closer and even went on a holiday together to Southend. But at the end of this trip, the tenant would fall suspiciously ill and begin suffering from agonizing stomach pain. After a local doctor headed to the home, Eliza was placed on bismuth and morphine. She was also sent to the Seddon home and cared for by Margaret. However, her condition would only worsen, and as she deteriorated, Eliza would become bedridden. Given her exposed predicament, Seddon convinced the ill tenant to make a will. The will was dictated and executed by Seddon himself, and all of this was witnessed by relatives. Then, just 2 days later, Eliza succumbed to her suspicious and then unidentified ailment. Following her passing, the landlord headed to a local doctor who issued an end-of-life certificate, which was done without even seeing a body. Suspicions were raised when Eliza's relatives found that Seddon had undertaken funeral preparations himself. He arranged a cheap funeral on a common plot and kept the small commission for himself. The choice of a common plot was particularly odd, since the Barrow family had a vault in Islington. Frank, the cousin of the deceased, was the most dubious over the sudden demise of his healthy cousin and the quickness of funerary arrangements. When he arrived in London to take over the possession of his late cousin's estate, he was met with shock. Nothing was left, and all had been grabbed up by Seddon, who'd claimed to have paid substantial funeral expenses and had even taken over the upkeep of the orphaned child. Despite the concerns, though, it was not until a year later that the truth behind Eliza's passing would be revealed. During the early 1900s, Dr. William Wilcox was making developments in forensic toxicology. He'd cultivated the first ever method of quantifying arsenic. As suspicions were being raised on the passing of Eliza, Wilcox found the perfect opportunity to test out his newfound technique. An inquest into her passing was opened by authorities, and her remains were exhumed. Wilcox and the young Bernard Spilsbury became leading pathologists in Britain and would go on to work with some of the most notorious homicides, which they found was the case of Eliza Barrow's. Seddon's obsession with money would ultimately lead him to homicide, all of which was in an effort to keep the money flowing into his pocket. The family man hatched a noxious plan in pursuit of an ever-growing wealth. During their investigation, Wilcox and Spilsbury employed the new technique and uncovered the presence of arsenic in Eliza's body, 2 grains worth in her stomach. The arsenic could have been obtained by soaking flypaper in regular water. Conveniently, the suspect seemed to have purchased a substantial amount of flypaper just before the victim's passing. It turned out that during that South End holiday, Seddon had sent one of his daughters to a local chemist where she would purchase some flypaper. Margaret and her husband were arrested and placed on trial. Against the advice of his counsel, the landlord opted to conduct his own defense. He claimed that the victim had drunk the water that the flypapers had been soaking in, which were in a dish in her bedroom to keep the flies away. These accusations only worsened the suspect's trial, and were certainly not enough to convince the jury. After a lengthy battle and sieving through the lies of the cunning landlord, he was found guilty. It would also be discovered that Seddon was, in fact, a former Freemason. He was asked by the clerk of court if he had anything to say about the penalty he would receive and why it should not be passed against him. Seddon's lengthy response was directed at the judge, a brother Mason. The criminal asked that the verdict be overturned, with some sources suggesting that with his plea, he made the first-degree sign, with others saying that he made the sign of grief and distress. But the judge, Justice Bucknell, who was also a prominent Freemason, responded with, "But our brotherhood does not encourage crime, it condemns it." Number 4. The Wiltshire County of England sits on a low plateau and basks in a rich history and enduring mysteries. It's here that you may find the Salisbury Plain, on which the enigmatic Stonehenge resides. Also in Wiltshire are the Westbury White Horse, the Cuckoo Stone, Sanctuary Circle, and Swanborough Tump. There's no doubt that this English county is home to many mysteries, ranging from standing stones to crop circles. A strange and enduring enigma that plagued the English residents for years, though, began in the 1970s, and more specifically in 1976. The first pattern appeared in a wheat field, taking the form of an obvious flying saucer nest. Crop circles began to appear in other fields, sparking a phenomenon that attracted and unnerved many. Amidst the patterns, there emerged stones with ancient images carved into them, dating back to 800 AD. Initially, the circles manifested in April in the corn crops and canola. Then it hit barley, oats, and wheat. No one could explain them. Scientists, pseudoscientists, conspirators, alien enthusiasts, and UFO experts flocked to the county, but still the Wiltshire crop circles remained unexplainable. The circles would take on various sizes, with the smallest being just 6 inches in diameter, and the largest containing 409 circles measuring 787 feet in diameter. With more patterns emerging every year, fluctuating in size and shape, pandemonium broke out. The stamped designs were seen as a lens that offered insight into the Earth's energies, the ancient spirits, and the anguish experienced by Mother Earth. Theories abound about impending doom, secret weapons testing, and extraterrestrial visitors. To make matters worse, many people reportedly felt some strange effects when visiting these sites. Some reported nausea and headaches, while others seemed to lose track of time. The fields, decorated with intricate designs, let off a strange atmosphere, so much so that anyone who was pregnant or those with a pacemaker were warned not to go near them. Visitors were told to leave instantly if they began to feel unwell. Others came away from the patterns with mysteriously cured illness, but scientists and self-proclaimed experts couldn't figure out why. For years, the enigmatic circles would haunt the Wiltshire residents, which persisted well into the 90s. It seemed, though, that these inexplicable symptoms must have been a shared delusion. While the Wiltshire crop circles certainly made headlines, it wasn't until 1991 that one headline would reveal the truth behind the mystery. The front pages of national newspapers spoke of the infamous circles, but they also repeated 2 names: Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley. It was these 2 co-conspirators who had created the creepy circles as a prank, not foreseeing the cultural phenomenon it would later become. Dave and Doug claimed responsibility for all of the Wiltshire circles that came about prior to 1987. This meant that each pattern, made over a span of 11 years, was made by the hands of man, with 0 mystical properties. Together, they created over 200 crop circles, duping the public and unnerving the masses. Dave's son, Jim, recalled how he found out that his father was behind it. David spilled the beans when Jim was a teenager, and looking back on it, everything just made sense. Since he was a child, Jim would wake up to a mysterious ear of corn on the kitchen countertop each Saturday. He often wondered how it had got there, but never thought too much of it. It was just an unexplained mystery, much like the crop circles. Jim even recalls a vivid memory of Dave coming into his room one stormy night. They were talking about the patterns and aliens. Dave asked him if he really thought extraterrestrials were behind them, and then he smiled. In 1991, Dave and Doug would make the front pages of newspapers by unmasking their prank. They were the creators of the circles. The two were hailed as the men who fooled the world, and that they did. Every Friday evening, the friends would drive half an hour from Shirley to Southampton. They would then head to the Percy Hobbs pub located in Winchester, Hampshire. After just a few pints, they would embark on a cunning ruse and go to the fields. As sunset was looming over them, the pair snuck in among UFO enthusiasts who sat upon the hillside. But while the watchmen were looking the other way, Dave and Doug would create immense circles under the cover of the darkness in adjacent fields. The next morning, the creations would stand out only to send shivers down the spines of residents who would happen across the patterns and farmers who would head off into their fields. The mischief makers would chuckle later in secrecy, delighted with the cries from UFO and alien experts, wondering how they could have missed them. Doug and Dave's prank would expand into more fields when they learned that cornfields were to be planted next to Cheesefoot Head. As the patterns burst into a worldwide phenomenon, the giggling pair vowed to keep their project a secret. This meant that they weren't allowed to tell their families and not even their wives. The duo would remain anonymous artists for over a decade, even though they signed their work with just 2 initials. Adding to their laughs, they would take their families off to Cheesefoot Head every Sunday to sit among UFO enthusiasts and sightseers to view the patterns. On Fridays, they would speak to the self-proclaimed experts who were on the lookout for aliens, asking them in jest if tonight was the night. A lot of effort was put into the ruse. Dave and Doug would make use of a plank and some rope to run amok in the fields, making 30 designs each summer. They stomped the crops without damaging the wheat shafts, and used the boards to create the circles. A piece of wire dangling from their baseball caps acted like a firearms sight, ensuring clean, straight, and otherworldly lines. The aging pair retired from their pranking days, but were amused to watch the copycats around the world embark on the same journey to con the public. Their confessions were accepted by scientists, but they also explained that the simpler designs were the works of magnetic shifts. As for enthusiasts, well, scientific explanations and the confessions of hoaxers weren't enough to convince and rule out an alien link. Nevertheless, that's at least one Wiltshire mystery solved. Number 3. The Whisper Bench sits among the floral splendor on 80th Street, west of Belvedere Castle. The nickname refers to a memorial bench nestling itself in the Central Park Shakespeare Garden. It commemorates a revered gentleman named Charles B. Stover and his quiet mysteries, the man who turned a stone mass smothered by poison ivy into a beautiful rock garden with a stream of water and pools of water lilies. Charles, a New Yorker who left behind a lasting legacy, was born in Pennsylvania in 1861. He graduated from Lafayette College and trained as a Presbyterian minister. He received his degree in 1984 from the Union Theological Seminary. Charles also studied very briefly at the University of Berlin. He traveled abroad and observed social workers at Tonybee Hall. This experience, along with other concerns about human conditions, prompted Charles and Stanton Coit to establish the Neighborhood Guild. This was operated from the basement of Forsyth Street. This was found to be the first ever settlement house in the United States. The house enlisted the aid of university students and became known as the University Settlement, which still provides social services today. On a summer afternoon in 1894, though, the now 33-year-old found himself wandering along the Thames embankment. He was suffering from a crisis of faith, leading him to give up the ministry. But as he was gazing down at the Thames, he was struck by an epiphany that prompted him to change his mind. This epiphany pushed him to continue the battle to establish a better New York. For another third of a century, Charles would go on to play an important role in the achievements of creating parks and playgrounds that we still see today in the city. But Charles, unlike most, wasn't in search of recognition. In fact, it was quite the opposite, as he preferred to stay quiet and shadowed. These activities, as a parks commissioner though, began taking a toll on both his mental and physical health. This is where the mystery of Charles B. Strover would begin. One day, in October of 1913, Charles would tell his staff that he'd be heading out for lunch, but instead he vanished. A nationwide search ensued in an effort to locate the missing commissioner, but to no avail. Days passed, and then weeks, but Charles was gone. Prior to his disappearing, new enemies had popped up in his life. This came with a productive yet stormy tenure, which also rekindled old antagonisms. At one point, the commissioner was in search of a greener New York, but Charles was no newcomer to political controversy. The disappearance came during his final 4-year term, and many wondered if any of these newfound enemies played a role in the suspicious disappearance. In mid-November of that year, a body was discovered in Delaware. Shocks ran over the community, distress circulated in the city, and sadness fell upon many. Once the remains had been investigated further, it was found that it wasn't Charles at all. In fact, just a week later, a city official spotted him in Washington, D.C., but this sighting was unconfirmed, and the search for the missing park commissioner pressed on. Despite investigations, no clues as to the man's whereabouts came about. This would be the strangest incident of his career, one that would instill trepidation in the community that had held him in high regard. 3 months had gone by with still no sign of Charles. The efforts included a film clip being sent to 10,000 moving picture places that were strewn across the United States. Then there came a revelation, but not through investigators, police, tips, or sightings. Instead, it came in the form of mail detailing Charles's resignation, which was addressed to be from Cincinnati. He was alive after all. In January of 1914, the former missing person emerged into society, solving his very own mysterious disappearance. As he popped up in New York, many began wondering what happened during his absence, and he claimed to have been on vacation. Charles told colleagues and others that he'd been touring the southern cities in an effort to study their parks and nature. On the 28th of January, following his reemergence, Charles headed for the university settlement and spoke of an exhaustive study that he made on the parks and municipal conditions of every important city in the South. But the full account of his holiday activities was never disclosed, leaving the entirety of his vacation a mystery. This bizarre episode in the history of the city remains one of the most shocking events and endures as a rather strange footnote. Following his disappearance, he was also suspended from his position and replaced by Louis F. LaRoche, his deputy. While his disappearance was solved, Charles B. Stover himself would remain an enduring enigma, leaving behind a rather faint paper trail, but no one knew him beyond the press accounts and anecdotes. During the remainder of his life, following the 3-month-long mystery that unsettled the New York community, Charles would develop a summer camp at Beacon. He would inscribe the garden gateway at the camp with the motto, quote, "Oneself must garden, and gardener be." A few years after he reemerged into society, Charles Stover passed away at the university settlement at the age of 68 years old. In commemoration of a revered man, the university settlement established the bench in Central Park. It was a unique 20-foot curved design, made from Deer Isle granite. The installment was nicknamed the Whisper Bench because if one were to whisper in one corner, the sound would travel mysteriously to the next, similar to the Whisper Hall of Grand Central Station. Adding to the obscurity of this individual is that there are only 2 portraits of him surviving. One was taken in the early 1900s, while the other was taken in the 1920s, with Charles sitting on a bench at the camp in Beacon. Number 2. It was the 24th of September in 1971. Neil L. Lafeve's 32nd birthday. Neil was a game warden for the nature reserve, Sensiba Wildlife Area, located in Brown County, Wisconsin. The warden's job was to protect the animals on the preserve from poachers, and he was known to have caught a few of them. But when Neil failed to return home from work that day, his wife Peggy became understandably worried, and a search was initiated for the missing man. It was soon uncovered that he'd last been seen posting signs across the preserve. The following morning, another discovery was made which would only instill a further concern in family, friends, and co-workers. The discovery ended up being Neil's pickup truck, which was left in a remote, swampy area. It was abandoned with no trace of the missing warden. During the search efforts, many locals would join the party in an effort to locate the missing man. One such person was a bow hunter named Marvin Olson, who took note of some freshly moved dirt. The dirt resembled that of a deer scrape, which was set deep in the marsh. A log had also been dragged around at the site, which prompted Olsen to start digging. He got to his knees and went for the dirt with his bare hands. It didn't take long for him to happen upon a belt buckle. An elbow soon emerged too, and Olsen's shouts alerted authorities. Authorities swarmed the site and the rest of the body was uncovered, but they soon found that something was missing. The head of the victim was gone. Luckily, it didn't take long for it to be located, as it had been positioned close by. It was Neil Lafave. This gruesome homicide would leave Peggy widowed and the children fatherless. The community was in utter shock and wondered how someone could take the life of someone as kind and compassionate as Neil. An investigation was immediately launched. The Madison, Wisconsin State Crime Lab was brought in, and they determined that the unfortunate victim had been fired upon multiple times with a .22 caliber rifle. It was determined that the person behind the act had left the scene and then returned along with a shovel and a different rifle. Alarmingly, it was this rifle that was used to separate the head from the body, with over 6 rounds being fired. The now separate parts were buried some yards away from the scene of the crime, both in shallow graves. Theories for motive were toyed with in the investigation. The first theory wondered if the homicide was planned, while the second suspected a confrontation that led to an unfortunate demise. Whether this was premeditated or not, justice was needed. Officers from both local and state agencies, along with the Department of Natural Resources, exhausted all of their efforts to find the criminal who committed this heinous act. Investigators decided to focus on the poachers, who were all dealt with by Neil, who was known to deal quite harshly with these individuals and would usually be the one making the arrest. Each of the poachers was brought in for questioning. Alibis were established for each of them, and those who could not have theirs corroborated were held for further evaluation. Those who hadn't been cleared yet were subjected to polygraph tests, despite the test's inherent inaccuracy. One man, though, opted not to take the test. It was 21-year-old Brian Hassong, who would gain much suspicion in the eyes of the authorities. His alibis were questionable, one of which brought his grandmother into the equation, claiming that at the time of the homicide, he was helping her with canned tomatoes. Hassong was a notorious poacher with a long history of run-ins with Neil, which included the issuing of a citation the previous fall. He was known to be a repeat offender and a bizarre individual who often frightened those around him. But there was little evidence to prove that he was the man behind the crime. One investigator believed that if they found the rifle that was used in the slaying, they would be able to convict the criminal. It appeared, though, that the weapon had vanished. Since Hassong refused a lie detector test, the authorities needed to find an alternate method to obtain evidence against the poacher. During this time, voice print analysis was in its prime. After obtaining a court order to make use of such analysis in the form of wiretapping, investigators were able to listen to any conversations that Hassong had through a house phone. This would be the first time that wiretapping was used to solve a homicide case, and what they heard was nothing short of disturbing. During the investigation, detectives uncovered something else that was incredibly horrifying. It was Hassong's past, which was filled to the brim with violence. It revealed a pattern of cruel and violent behavior, including one scene where he slammed another's head into the cement, only stopping after a neighbor intervened. At the time that the wiretaps were installed on the phone, Hassong was staying at his girlfriend's house. The authorities devised a cunning plan by teaming up with the local flower shop. They borrowed the delivery vehicle and dressed one of the deputies as a delivery man. The undercover officer asked for a phone number to confirm the delivery, and Hassong fell right into the trap. With the wiretap in place, the investigators were given 72 hours to catch the suspect, making a cruel mistake. And that he did. During this time, the detectives would also begin searching Hassong's relatives' homes for the missing rifle, which would make him incredibly nervous. 2 days into the operation, Hassong made a crucial mistake and called his grandmother using the house phone that was wiretapped. During their conversation, the suspect referred to one of the detectives named Moray, stating that he was up to something. He also instructed her not to let anyone get their hands on, quote, that rifle that he left with her. After hearing this, an immediate search warrant for the grandmother's house was issued and executed. Initially, she claimed ignorance, but later admitted that her daughter had taken the firearm earlier that day. The police, along with Hassong's elderly and no implicated grandmother, headed for her daughter's business premises. They warned the woman in possession of the rifle to stop obstructing justice, and she reluctantly handed it over. It had been broken down and thoroughly wrapped in dirt-stained plastic. Further analysis confirmed that this was the weapon used in the slaying of Neil Lafave. On the 15th of December in 1971, 3 months after the homicide, Hassan was arrested. A voice identification expert verified that it was in fact him on the recorded call. The following year, he was prosecuted after 4 hours of jury deliberation, but the events don't end there. While being escorted to the Green Bay State Prison, he began threatening everyone in his vicinity, stating that if he ever got out of prison, he would find them. He even went as far as stating that the homicide of Neil would look like child's play in comparison to what he would do to them. In July of 1979, the criminal was transferred to a maximum security penitentiary. Then he was taken to a medium security prison called Fox Lake Correctional Institution, and 9 months later, he escaped. If he had sat just another 3 years, he would have been eligible for parole. Number 1. It was 1961 and a day like any other, only it was about to take a very dark turn when 3 cave explorers happened upon a previously hidden artifact. The group had come across something strange in Swansea, Wales in a cave. It was the remains of a human being. Luckily, by this time, forensic anthropology was in its prime, a useful tool that would go on to solve some decades-old mysteries. To understand just exactly what forensic anthropologists solved, we have to travel back to 1919 in Caswell Bay in Wales. Caswell Bay was struck by a tragedy that year with the disappearance of an Englishwoman. Amy Stewart, known to most by her adopter name Mamie, was born in 1893 in Sunderland. At an early age, she discovered a keen interest and pure talent for the art of dancing. She also found the passion to perform in great music halls and West End theaters. By the age of 15, Mamie had performed as a chorus girl in a group known as the Magnets. Later, she left her home in pursuit of a show business career. This led her to establish the dance troupe known as the Five Verona Girls. The girls performed all across the United Kingdom and became unusually popular in the conservative era. In 1917, the group dispersed after one of the ladies fell pregnant and another broke an ankle. By this time, Mamie was 23 years old, and she decided to move back to Sunderland with her parents. Here, she would go on to meet George Shotton, a marine engineer. He introduced himself as a widower, a piece of information that will become quite daunting later. Months after the two met, Shotton proposed, and the two married in 1918. They moved to Swansea and then to Caswell Bay, all while Mamie maintained regular contact with her family. The former choir girl believed that she had just entered her dream life with white picket fences and a wealthy husband, but Shotton had lied about being a widower. His wife was still very much alive and still very much married to him. Her name was Mary, and they had a son together, but they were living in Penarth. Mary believed that her husband's absence was due to his line of work, when in actuality he was living a whole other life. This other life took an abrupt turn with acts of violence and mistreatment directed at Mamie. It was early 1919 when Mamie sent letters to her parents. In the letters, she hinted at the unhappiness and an increase in violence. She also expressed the desire to leave her husband, who forbade her from going on stage, among various other preventions. In the later months of that same year, she sent another letter, and as usual, they responded. Oddly, the letter was returned to them with the mark "House Closed." Initially, they thought this to be an error and sent a telegram response instead, but this was returned too with the same marking. Just before Christmas, though, the Stewart family would receive their very last letter from Mamie, this time sending the season greetings. After this, both Mamie and Shotton ceased communicating. The following year, staff working at the Grosvenor Hotel in Swansea found something odd. It was a leather case with no address that had been left behind by a guest the previous December. For 3 months, it went unclaimed until the hotel manager contacted the police. Inside, they found dresses and shoes belonging to a woman. Unsettlingly, these items were intentionally ripped beyond repair. Among the torn items were jewelry, a rosary, a Bible, and a manicure set. Inside the chest was also a scrap piece of paper that detailed Mamie's parents' address. Police contacted them and found that they'd been unable to reach Mamie for months and hadn't been able to locate her either. The police were directed then to those letters detailing a violent relationship. The parents had also obtained another note that instructed them to contact a woman and friend of Mamie, Mrs. Hearn, should anything happen to her. She revealed the mistreatment that her friend suffered at the hands of her husband. A maid would also later find a brown leather handbag that belonged to Mamie, hidden behind a dresser containing a sugar ration card and £2 worth of change. As spring rolled in, the South Wales police believed that Mamie was no longer alive and that Shotton had been the one to take her life. Scotland Yard sent Chief Inspector William Draper to oversee the investigation. He initiated searches of the area to find the missing chorus girl, but no traces of her were found there. A nationwide search was the next effort to be prompted, but this too proved futile. In the eyes of both Scotland Yard and the South Wales Police, Shotton was the prime suspect. Draper was able to locate him. He was living in Penarth with Mary and his son. He admitted to knowing Mamie and claimed to have left the ripped-up clothing in the trunk for her at the hotel. Shotton alleged that the two had an argument and she left him. Despite the evidence against him, neither police force could move forward with a conviction because there was no body. Adding to the frustration was the numerous sightings of Mamie that would surface in the years to come. She'd been seen in Canada, India, Australia, and even South Africa. Thomas James alleged to have seen her in Pakistan, where she was traveling with performers. When approached about the subject of Mamie, the woman denied being her and hurriedly left. These sightings would undoubtedly be disproven 42 years later. Fast forward to that 1961 discovery, where the remains now rest at the Home Office Forensic Laboratory in Cardiff. Here, the remains would be pieced together to form a complete anatomy. Wisdom teeth x-rays placed the age of the individual between 20 and 28 years old. The longer features hinted at a height of 5 feet and 4 inches tall. A few strands of surviving hair determined brown hair. Marks on the remains also revealed an active segmentation, separating the body into 3 pieces. A wedding ring marked 1918 was also found, along with tassels of clothing belonging to an early 20s era. Investigators were confident that the unidentified remains were the victim of a 40-year-old homicide, but most records had been destroyed during the Second World War. Despite this, the police force opted to release much of the information to the public in hopes that someone knew something. Adding to the list of features was that the cranium and pelvis suggested that the victim was female. These details combined led many to remember the eerie disappearance of the chorus girl, Mamie Stewart, all the way back in 1919. At the time, George Shotton had been charged but was acquitted, given the lack of a body. But he was, however, charged with bigamy, to which he pleaded not guilty. He alleged that someone had stolen his name to marry Mamie, but many witnesses testified against this. After serving just 18 months in prison, he was released and Mary divorced him. He was later arrested again and sentenced to 12 months of labor for threatening his sister with a firearm. Despite numerous inquiries and searches, the police couldn't tie him to the crime involving the missing chorus girl. The remains found in the cave in 1961 were, in fact, Mamie Stewart. This revelation, though, came just 3 years short as Shotton succumbed to natural illness in 1958. This Christmas marks the 105th anniversary of Mamie Stewart's now solved disappearance. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.